Welcome, friends. I'd like to introduce Cornelia Hancock, otherwise known as Doris Tice, local person, very active with the Hancock House, Friends of the Hancock House, and she is going to give us a little glimpse of Cornelia Hancock and who she was and why and that sort of thing. So, welcome.
You would pass these out?
Yep.
I don't think you'll need all of these. This is not going to be a rerun of Cornelia leaving Hancock's Bridge and going to Gettysburg and going south to the school. This is going to fill in the other part of her life. You have to know the situation. On the back of that paper, it talks, I put down a brief section on Cornelia's ancestors. And you have to understand them to understand her. I used to use this as not a rules girl, because Cornelia broke every rule and every picture we have of a single woman in Victorian times. She did not follow the pattern of the person who stayed at home and just was content and so forth and so on. She was very restless. She had a background from the Nicholson side of her family. If you go down, you can see that Thomas married Rachel Nicholson. Rachel, you need to know, was from the Mannington area, and it's ironic that they're talking about the William Nicholson house in Mannington Township, because that's her father's birthplace. And she had connections to Hancock's Bridge, but her early years were in Philadelphia. And that's the key why everything is kind of connected to Philadelphia, Hancock's Bridge and Philadelphia. The river was the turnpike between here and up there. There was active shipping going on at all times. They were shipping furs and etc. out of Hancock's Bridge right on up to Philadelphia in those days. I thought people, were born and stayed in the same place in those years. But I find out they're all over the place. More so almost than we are. But she had, Solomon Ware married a Sarah Stretch. And that was the Ware Shor's house, which is right down the creek here on the south side, just outside the village itself here. Sarah, their daughter, Sarah Ware, married Joshua Thompson of Elsinboro. And if you notice, William Hancock married a Thompson. Now, there were a couple Thompson families, but again, of Elsinboro, which is right across the creek. Then Sarah Ware married Joshua Thompson, and their daughter Elizabeth married William Nicholson. And that's where you get the William Nicholson house in Mannington. Now, Rachel Nicholson, of course, married Thomas Hancock, and their daughter Ellen, who was about 9 years older than Cornelia, married Dr. Henry Childs. Now, the Childs were of Philadelphia. They were, their business made the first clock for the Free Library of Philadelphia, for instance. They were very, very, very active in the charities and the abolitionist movement. In fact, I read a letter that Dr. Child's sister wrote about her life. And in her letter, she is talking about they had a country house for the summers they went to, and they went to meeting there, and Frederick Douglass spoke. Then later on in her letter, she talked about going to Maine and seeing Freddie there. Well, that really, to speak about Frederick Douglass, you always say Frederick, never Freddie, but she called him Freddie. I guess they were on a close, the families were close, and they were able to say Freddie. Anyway, that's one, and this Nicholson family also had a daughter who married Thomas Mathers, and one who married Sylvester Garrett, the Garrett Buchanan Paper Company in Philadelphia. So you can see all the Nicholson connections with Philadelphia. And then William, Rachel's father, had a store in Philadelphia, so therefore she spent her young life in Philadelphia. Now, after that, I could never understand why south after Gettysburg they said about living in the village, because I live in the house where she was born. Her father inherited the Hancock house and 400 acres of land, etc. And I'll read something that she wrote about her father pretty soon, and you'll understand. So he was a gentleman farmer. He read his papers, he talked about the politics and so forth with the neighbors and that type of thing, but he didn't do a whole lot more. He fished. And I wonder why they talked about walking by a neighbor's house, and she looked in and her father told her not that she shouldn't do that it wasn't her business and so forth. And I couldn't understand until I looked at the census. In 1850, they lived up the creek in the house that's known as the Cornelia Hancock house. In 1860, by 1860 census, they were living right down the street here from the meeting house, and she, of course, was teaching there. And the reason that she was there, I found a snippet of a map at Gloucester County Historical Society of Hancock's Bridge. So I copied it and so forth, and I thought it was Richard Hancock that lived in the house down the street. But it wasn't. I found out Rachel Nicholson Hancock and Morris Hancock, who was from the Elsinboro Hancocks, he married Thomas's, her Rachel's sister-in-law, Sarah Hancock. Morris Hancock married Sarah Hancock. They were like second cousins. And Rachel and Morris went into business buying houses here in Hancock's Bridge. And that's how, and the house is listed as R. Hancock. And again, in those days, women normally didn't have, if their husband was living, they didn't have the house listed as R. Hancock. It should have been Thomas Hancock. So her mother was a very independent woman. She was Quaker minister, and she passed her traits down to my mother-in-law. And my mother-in-law would say, you know, I want to get something done, and she would want it done yesterday. Impatient, etc., get it done, so forth. And my husband, unfortunately, got the same traits. Of the two boys, he got the Hancock traits, his brother got the Tice traits. Anyway, so you have to kind of know where Cornelia got her traits. Now, I found an old clipping in the Woodstown Piles Grove Historical Society, and it was from, I think, 1925, November 11th. It didn't say what newspaper it was in, but it gives you a really good picture of her father and her mother. She talks about all through the township, Miss Hancock said, my father was known as Thomas Y. the fisherman, and as the one man in those parts who was foolish enough to vote for Fremont in the election of 1856. He was a silent man who spent his time thinking and fishing the little stream known as Alloways Creek, a tributary of the Delaware, and I never knew of his having any other occupation except that of reading the newspapers, reading and fishing. Okay, from what I read about him, it was like whatever. He just went along because Rachel was calling the shots. Anyway, she talks about him having a single boat made, and he called it ITYT. He had those letters put on there. And the reason he did it was to make people ask what the name of the boat was, and all it was is you pronounce it ITYT, just to have somebody ask and, do that type thing. I also found Baker's Tavern. We had a ledger given to us from Baker's Tavern, which was the reason that they sold the Hancock house 3 years after he and Rachel married in the Hancock house. They leased out that tavern section to a baker, and we found one of the ledgers. Well, in the ledger, I found Thomas Y. Hancock, 1 dram, Thomas Y. Hancock, 2 drams, etc., all through Baker's ledger. And here, what he would do is he would put his boat in where we live on the Alloways Creek, go down to the Hancock house, and then he would sit there and read the newspaper and talk to his friends and so forth there during the day, and then he'd go back home. Now, in one place, Cornelia said rather than selling his fish, he gave them to the neighbors. Well, half the time he didn't fish. He was in the tavern drinking. And the two things his wife hated was alcohol and slavery. And so that was the reason they sold the Hancock house, because of the alcohol in the tavern. So this is the house, this is the ancestral genes that Cornelia started with. Mother and father who were direct opposites in many, many ways. And that was the big way that they were opposite. Now, I like off-the-cuff, crazy things about history, because when you're teaching, kids don't want to know, they don't want to memorize dates, that this happened on this date and that date. I like to put some flesh and blood on people and see their good points as well as their not so good ones. This is an article I found in the Gettysburg magazine, and it really hit me as unusual because it says, "What did Gettysburg smell like?" Now, Cornelia was very well written in her letters, and described. It starts, the first two words are Cornelia Hancock of this article in this Gettysburg magazine. And it goes on to say, Hancock was so overcome by the smell that she viewed it as an oppressive, malignant force capable of killing the men who were forced to lie amid the corpses until the medical company visual records, no photographs of the aftermath, etc. Well, she really, that's her description, and her description of the battle scenes are maybe some of the only ones they have that were vivid and meant something to the people who are reading her letters. And that's why she's quoted so many times. Now, I had a map also, I think this was from the Gettysburg magazine, has a map showing she was all over the place with the Second Corps Hospital. She was, Fredericks, in one of the towns. Now, first I heard she was the first woman into Richmond. Then I read it was into Fredericksburg. But nevertheless, she was all over with that battle, the Gettysburg and the Wilderness, Battle of Wilderness, Port Royal, White House Landing, City Point, and that's where her brother was, at City Point. And so she really covered, and she talked about, she and Mrs. Husband were in a wagon one time near the battlefront, and the bullet went right between or cannonball went right between she and Mrs. Husband on this wagon one time. So she was really where the action was. And that meant that when the war was over, there was no action here. She told her mother that and family that she could not make a living coming back here. She didn't really like teaching school. She taught at the school here. She didn't really like it. So she said she just could not make a living coming back here. So from then on, she just visited for the rest of her life. She visited here, visited her parents and so forth. My mother-in-law said she remembers her, and she said, Aunt Cornelia if we went out and slammed the screen door, she would make us come back and close it quietly. She was a stickler, and she had to have things just so. She, for that reason, she went to Philadelphia and was funded by the abolitionists in Philadelphia. And she followed a woman by the name of Laura Town, who spent her final adolescent years in Philadelphia. Her father made lots of money. He went from Pittsburgh, he was farming there, or he went into a business in Boston. Anyway, he made lots and lots of money, and he decided to retire in Philadelphia. So Laura was, of course, connected to Philadelphia. And she went down to the St. Helena Island, which had virtually no white people there, except a small guard of soldiers. there were about 6,000 Negroes, ignorant and dependent. Now, she went down there in 1862, at the beginning of the war, and she founded a school down there. She was also a physician. So she, not only the school, but she also did some work as a doctor there. The government of South Carolina soon recognized the value of Miss Towns' work and gradually appointed her as superintendent of other schools until she had the supervision of 17 schools beside her own. And she was superintendent for Cornelia in Mount Pleasant, because St. Helena Island is just south of Mount Pleasant. She also said, Miss Hancock, and they visited back and forth on like Easter. There were things in there about Easter, Cornelia visiting Lauratown at St. Helena Island, and so forth. And it says that Miss Hancock went up by sea and says she never would try it again if it were not for the difference in cost. Because Cornelia didn't have money, not like Lauratown and some of the others. And another friend, Emily Howland. Now, Emily, I tripped over her. There was one other thing. This was Emily. Emily went to school. She was a resident in New York State. Her father was part of the Underground Railroad up there. And you see Secretary of State Seward. Their families were very friendly, and Mrs. Seward was kind of a mentor to Emily. Emily went to school with Ellen in Philadelphia, the Mary Grew School. And if you know the Mary Grew School, she was for, women, equality, etc. And so Ellen and Emily went to school with a few others. Ellen was the only one who married. The rest decided that since one of their classmates did marry, she was an heiress, her husband was unfaithful, gambled, etc., and lost her whole fortune, because when you married, your husband got control of whatever you had. And they decided they weren't getting married because no man was going to take what they had. And so Emily and the rest of them did not marry. Well, Emily, and as I said, Ellen, were good friends. And later, Emily, who was founding a school for freedmen in Virginia, her father, of course, financed it, and she founded the school there and was very happy doing that and was very independent, etc., because women just didn't do that kind of thing. Anyway, when Emily, at Dr. Breed's house in Washington, and you notice they're on the list of acquaintances, Cornelia met Emily at Dr. Breed's house in D.C., because Emily was working in D.C. before she founded the school. And they became really good friends. And from then on, they traveled together and everything. And almost everything is connected with the Howlands. It said Emily was 1869 marks Emily's first full-fledged attempt in self-discovery. She tried to lead a quiescent life at her home in Sherwood, New York. She soon became restless and discontent, Cornelia also, with this return to an essentially domestic role. She came home to help with her father. Her mother died. She struggled with but could not make a successful transition from Reconstruction reformer to rural domestic in so short a time. She acknowledged being tied by an invisible bonds to her father, yet she was clearly unhappy with this voluntary form of enslavement. And, you know, it could describe Cornelia the same way, because she did not want to come back here because there was no challenge to life, and it was dull and so forth. When enthusiastically supported Cornelia Hancock's new plan to model a colony on Cat Island, South Carolina, after her Acadia, the two women began to work ways to enlist Slocum Howland's financial and moral support in this venture. These two women touched upon more than familial relationships, and their concern for Southern Black education. However, Cornelia repeatedly returned to the theme of role alternatives for single women. You know, there's that slavery work plus single women independence all through this. And she said that they returned to role alternatives for single women in their Southern work. I am so impressed with the feeling it is such a sphere of usefulness open for single women to come among and be eyes, ears, and understanding for these people for a time, Cornelia told Emily. Now, so you don't read this type thing in South after Gettysburg, because I knew there had to be more to Cornelia for her to do what she did in that 1800s. And you find this woven all through, and they would not have done that. They would not have been educated, number one. But Emily, Cornelia were both educated because they were Quaker. And the Quaker background runs through everything they did, really. And they wouldn't have had that independence but for that. I had a devil of a time finding out where Cat Island was, because there's two in South Carolina. There's one in the north, and then I finally found, even the people down there were like at the library I went to and so forth, they were like, Cat Island. Well, come to find out, it has wound up as a nature preserve. But they tried to, Cornelia Hancock had written from London, she went to London, the year before about the innovative ways the English aided their needy. Now Emily heard that her lively friend was setting up a family society in Philadelphia to visit and oversee aid to destitute families. See, she's back at 634 Race Street, living with her sister. Because along about there, Dr. Child, who was older than Ellen, died. And Ellen was not left with a lot of money. She had this house there, but she had to take in boarders to be able to survive in Philadelphia. And so Cornelia was staying with her as kind of a boarder. But Cornelia also reported on the Cat Island plantation, they called it, which had cost father $1,350 10 years ago, and Cornelia herself $723. Now, where she got $723 back there, but she got it somewhere. And it says, though this little island, which could be reached only by ferry, had failed to attract colored settlers, they wouldn't buy from white people after the Civil War down there. They didn't trust them because there were so many, what did they call the ones that were down there after, what? Yes. And so they wouldn't buy the land that on this island because Cornelia and of course Mr. Hallam were white. But it says that still there was ample phosphate for mining. So I imagine they got their money back, but I don't know that they made a huge profit. It said, whatever Cornelia had felt for Dr. Dudley, all these projects certainly fitted her abilities better than being a village wife, Emily thought. And Dr. Dudley, you've read about, if you've read South After Gettysburg, there was always the thought that she was romantically involved with Dr. Dudley. Well, she and Emily decided that Dr. Dudley did not fit in their plan because Dr. Dudley did not have the zeal to do for the freedmen that Cornelia had. He looked down on them and so forth and so on. And so he wouldn't, he just, that was not to be. So she even had a 8x10 picture of him. Anyway, down on the island in those days, I went down to the current school. The school that she found it was in five different buildings. One was the church. The church is still there. One of them, this one is huge, this building. I know one of them was destroyed by an earthquake. And I don't know what happened with the others, but they're in the fifth building. And it's ironic because Mount Pleasant was then a black town. A lot of the people came, they would work maybe in Charleston, the blacks, and then they would go back to Mount Pleasant. And it was common to find people that would go out in the meadows and get the grasses and dry them and everything and make baskets. And they would just sell them along the road in Mount Pleasant. But I guess Northerners decided that this was a good place to settle because it wasn't so cold in the winter. And they have developments there. And when I spoke to the school down there, the people they named the library, the Cornelia Hancock Library down there. And I think there may have been one black kid, but everybody was all white there. So that whole area has made a complete change from what it began as a black, normal settlement. I was surprised. The weeds are even the same down there. A lot of our weeds and things, I could see there. And of course it was warm in the summer because that was the only time I could go. I spent as much time as I would like to spend more time there, digging out places, but I did find that just as I walked in, there was the bulletin board with all the pictures and her picture in the center. At that point, we hadn't found the picture of her as a young person. Luckily, with the Friends of the Hancock House, we had reenactments and so forth, and Viola Smithcore's grandmother, I believe, was a Hancock, and she found that picture of Cornelia as a young woman in her grandmother's things. And that was the first time that we, and she also founded the Cornelia Hancock Auxiliary to the Sons of Union Veterans. So that, you know, a roundabout way, slowly, slowly, we're trying to get some recognition for her. Now, Cornelia didn't stop after she founded the school, and that's where everything seemed to stop. She went to, of course, she lived in Philadelphia most of the time, and Joseph Abbott lived in Philadelphia, but he was originally from there, and I imagine the families knew each other. He was hired to manage a brand new hotel in a place called Sanford, Florida. You may recognize that name as being getting on and off the auto train. That's how I recognize the name. And so when I found out that she did this, I, of course, went early to get on the auto train coming home one time. I was taking care of my aunt who lived in Florida. And I found Sanford, the namesake of the hotel. He had the hotel built and everything. Was an interesting person. Cornelia was hired. She wasn't called an assistant manager, but she was. Her organization skills were terrific. She had charge of getting the kitchen up and running and the help to cook and so forth, and get the maids trained. Because Sanford, when they came down to visit, see, people would come down from Boston, New York, Washington, D.C., Philadelphia. They could come down by ship and come in the St. John River to this Lake Monroe, which they said was 5 miles across. I mean, it's a huge lake. The hotel is no longer there, but people would come down in the winter. Now, Sanford was not from Philly or from Florida. He was an international figure. Henry Shelton Sanford was best known for giving his name to a small town, Lake Monroe, and turning it into a thriving shipping port and a railroad hub, as well as helping to breed better citrus and expand the market for Florida-grown fruit. Now, his father died when he was just 18, I guess. He was 18. When he was just 14, his father sent him on a 2-month trip to Michigan, then untamed Indian Territory, to look over his family's holdings. His father's death left him rich but feeling isolated. So anyway, it was a tack factory that was right there in Connecticut, I believe it was. They called him a Connecticut Yankee. Anyway, he left his business, his uncles run the business, and he went over to Europe. He got asthma when he was in school, and so they said a sea voyage would do him some good. So he embarked upon the first of 75 transatlantic crossings. In Europe in the early 1840s, he resumed his studies, becoming fluent in German, French, Spanish, and Italian. In Heidelberg, Germany, he earned his law degree, and his 40-year career in diplomacy began after a visit to St. Petersburg, Russia in 1847. The U.S. minister to Russia, a family friend from Connecticut, persuaded him, then 24, to accept a diplomatic post at age 24. Anyway, to make a long story short, he wound up marrying a woman in Belgium. But the woman in Belgium was from Philadelphia. Now, they would come over to Sanford, Florida, and she was like, oh, you know, I want to be back in Europe, where, you know, that type thing. So she kept putting it down and so forth. But anyway, Cornelia went down there with Joseph Abbott, and they ran this big hotel. In the summer, this is in the late 1870s, in the summer, they came back to Seaside Heights. Now, I've never been up there to Seaside Heights to check this out, but they ran a hotel in Seaside Heights in the summer. So that's what she did for a few years. And as usual, her organization skills, you know, are what got her through and so forth. Now, the last part of this is she knew, and I found this out, some of this information I found out in the weirdest ways. One day I went over to Swarthmore, to the Friends Library with Ruth Hall Brooks, and we went in there and I did some research. Anyway, in Cornelia's obituary, which was which was in the Friends Intelligencer, they talked about Cornelia, and it said, back in Philadelphia, younger friend of Lucretia Mott, of Susan B. Anthony, and other prominent women. Well, Ellen, her sister, was the one who initially was friends with Lucretia Mott. So Cornelia knew her, met her and everything. And they talk about, and I researched this, Cornelia and Dr. Child were two of the founders for the Family Aid Society first, and then the Children's Aid Society. And you'll see that they were both credited with being founders. Then she became friends with Octavia. She was friends with a woman. Father had a factory in South Philly. The project that she put most of herself into was a housing project at Point Breeze. And I checked out maps and so forth with where I think it was, because the names and all have changed. And they said that there were just dirt streets. They allowed the pigs to run, and they leased their houses. The factory workers leased it from the factory owner, the housing. And so she had gone over to London, which I told you before, and studied things like worker housing and so forth. And she and the owner's daughter convinced the owner of the factory and the houses to sell the houses to the owners, or to the factory workers themselves, so they would take care of it. And this is what, because they used to leave the pigs run in there. They used to empty their chamber pots out the window into the street. And, it must have been horrible. But they convinced the owner to sell to the factory workers. She established a bank, a library, and etc. in the workers' village there for that factory. And that was one thing. It was called, it said that they formed for the better housing of the poor of the city, and had previously visited London districts that owned their improvement and liveliness to a woman called Octavia Hill. Due to this knowledge and experience, to her ability to get others to do for themselves, and to her direct plans of action, she was asked by the owner to take charge of Wrightsville at Point Breeze. And that was the at the owners and act as the owner's agent and social engineer. Here, for 15 years, she worked over problems of paving, sewage, garbage, problems of shiftlessness, carelessness, ignorance, and she was able to manage both municipal government and the human nature of her tenants successfully. The 60 comfortable homes in satisfactory surroundings owned by their occupants, as testified in 1915. So that's where she spent a good chunk of her time there in Philadelphia, again, living with her sister. And it's amazing the things. She had 300 students down in the South in that school for freedmen, and an adult school for the adults who worked during the day. She had night school for the adults to learn to read and write. And her thing was teach them how to take care of themselves. And that was her point, to be self-sufficient and take care of yourself all the way through. And that's what this project was. Somewhere along the line, when she finally decided, I guess, to retire, she went to Emily Howland had a cottage on Little Deer Isle, Maine, which is on a little island just off of Penobscot Bay. And actually, the Stratton Jaquette was here one time and showed me the picture. A picture of Cornelia, but she was on the porch of Emily Howland's cottage. And it was the one owned by the Jaquettes was called Rest a While Cottage. What happened was, she was allowed to rent rooms in this cottage, this Rest a While Cottage, and this was the sign. It says, Rest a While Cottage, Eggemogan, Maine. Rooms in an old-fashioned farmhouse are available for self-supporting women desiring a restful and an inexpensive vacation. Notice, self-supporting women. Again, desiring a restful and an inexpensive vacation. Wide and beautiful wood paths. Eggemogan is a steamboat landing where it's located at the post office about a mile distant from Rest a While. Good grocery stores in the near neighborhood where during the season table supplies can be purchased. And then for further information, Emily Howland's niece was taking care of the inquiries for this place that Cornelia was renting rooms for. But it had to be self-sufficient women. And Stratton Jaquette still had the cottage, the last I heard. His Stratton's son, brother, I guess, lives in North Jersey. Now, we come to the thing that directly is to do with my husband. They all called her Aunt Cornelia. Well, I don't have proof, but at some point, she had a set of twins, and twins run in the Hancock family. And Harvey Hancock, my husband's namesake and grandfather, is one twin. I've never found the other twin. I know that Grandpa they said got a postcard or something from the other twin, who was at that time, this is when they were in their 70s probably, living in Florida. That's all I know. I went over to the Pennsylvania archives, but that's all the farther. But the reason I really got into this is because Eleanor Hancock Jaquette was my mother-in-law's sister. She was the oldest in the family. And she did not have any children. And so they called her Yelner. Had a book of Cornelia's from school, where she went to Mary Grew School in Philadelphia. And she had this book. Well, of course, it was a geography book of Pennsylvania or something like that. Of course, I looked through and I found a letter in that book. Later, Aunt Eleanor said she had never looked in it. Well, I did. And in there was a letter that said, home, Thursday evening, 1864. Now, there was never a Harvey in the Hancock family. This letter said, Brother Harvey, right there. So that really got me looking. And he talks about the orchard. The folks at home are well. They're getting something in the account. They were getting anxious, I guess, from not hearing from you in so long. And it talks about Charlie Fredericks and some other things. And it was signed, your brother, Will Martin McChesney. Now, that was one clue. Another clue that I found was in Fogg's. Now, you have to know, Elizabeth Fogg married Harvey Hancock. So there's the direct connection to the Foggs. And one of them had, in those days, I know my Cheeseman relatives, ancestors, kept the diary, the Wanamaker diary. It was always the Wanamaker and, department stores. And in the diary was this, December 1927, which is when Cornelia died, Saturday 31st of December. 42, raining, Aunt, A-N-T, Cornelia died this morning, H, mother, Harvey's mother. So that's the other clue I found. And then I went to William Hancock's muster out what company and so forth he was in. And Ellen Conklin wrote a book about the women at Gettysburg. About 1993, she stopped down, and so she was kind enough, she had, I guess, connections to get into the archives in DC and get into the back where you could get every piece of paper that had to do with that soldier or whatever. She got all of Cornelia's and all of her brother's pension papers and so forth. And she also got this paper. This young man, Harry, he mustered in Trenton in the same company where Captain William Hancock was, and they mustered him in as Harry McChesney. And the only other paper she found was his paper where he mustered out, and he mustered out as Harvey McChesney, and he was age 18. He was in for 100 days. He was paid $8.22 for his 100 days in. And that's the only paper she found in the archives for a Harvey McChesney. So the question is, is this true? And I kind of think that the family kind of indicated that he was. I found some of them. Ruth Hall Brooks was doing some checking. She found some down in Virginia, but I found some in that were here and then moved north and then on up to New York State. So I haven't, for the past 10 years, I haven't been doing much of any of this, simply because, my husband has Alzheimer's, so I've been tied up, yes.
When did Cornelia die?
1927.
She's buried in the Armorsville Cemetery.
Yes.
We celebrate her Cornelia Hancock Day this summer.
Pete Michelle, or Pete Michael, is going to have, he has made the display boards. They look like the boards you see like in Gettysburg, in the Visitor Center and so forth. And he's finished painting them a pale gray. And now I'm going to take him all of my papers on William and on Cornelia. And he is going to open up a display on Cornelia in July. July 6th is the day she arrived in Gettysburg, and so he's going to be doing that, and he's putting it in that cabin on the property. So that's, we'll be getting together this month and getting that up and going.
I'm always surprised when they do Cornelia Hancock Day. They do a driving tour of the area. And this is one of those stops, and I'm always amazed at how many people.
Yeah, and also at the vacant, I guess it's a vacant lot now, of the house where Rachel, Cornelia, and Thomas, and one of their grandchildren, I think one of Elizabeth's children, moved somewhere between 1850 and 1860. So she did leave from Hancock's Bridge, but it was hard to, I just couldn't visualize how she could walk by a neighbor's house when there wasn't anything around. We were in the middle of 96 acres. And then when I saw that census, and then I realized that R. Hancock was Rachel Hancock. So anyway, Cornelia ended her days in Ventnor at 53 North Delancey Place, living with one of the her sister's descendants at the end, and that's where she died, in Delancey Place in 1927. Well, it's other than what you read in everything. And you find this information in the weirdest places. And when you're not looking for it, you find it.
So I found myself wondering, listening to you, thinking we need Steven Spielberg or somebody to take on this story and give us a series on TV or something of films that could really. There's so many characters in there, of interesting people and connections.
Do you know she and Laura Town, the one who founded the school, was superintendent of schools down in St. Helena Island, they were traveling back to Philadelphia, and they stopped in D.C., And this was after Lincoln was assassinated, because Lincoln was one of her heroes. Anyway, they stopped in D.C., and when they came out, they said, Cornelia said, "I know now how they stand. President Johnson has the power, but not the will to do for the freedmen. Secretary of State Seward has the will, but not the power." Now, can you imagine in the 1800s, a single female coming out and saying something like that? That's something that they always attribute to the male as saying something as earth-shaking as that. But she had them right there, and that's what she amazes me because of that.
Well, thank you. This has been
Thank you.
most interesting.
Well, it's not what, the usual, what's found. Oh, and by the way, one of the things that women and Quakerism, did any of you read? See, I taught with Sarah Ridgway Farley. And just by coincidence, my husband worked with her husband, Pat. And we became very friendly, and I went to meetings sometimes with her. And she was the first one who really got me involved with Quakerism. And then when I found out, I wondered why when I was choosing my major for college, I knew I wanted to teach because I had taught Sunday school. And I wound up saying to myself, look, the high school teachers make more money than the elementary school teachers. So if I'm going to work, I'm going to get more money if I go and teach the high school. Well, by the time I graduated, everybody was paid the same, but I'm thinking, why would I think that? My mother was the one who said to my father, "Oh no, she's not going to study, be a secretary." It's a good thing because I never have learned how to keyboard. She's going to take college prep, which I did. But then I found out, and I haven't found out details, one of her ancestors, her great-grandmother, was Ellen Bettle, Bettle. And she came from, Bettlewood is Collingswood. And so she came from that Collingswood, Haddonfield area. And from what I understand now, she was Quaker. And so I think that's where my mother got the independence. She did all the banking and everything, and my father signed his paycheck. They would have thought it was a forgery, because she did everything. And when I read this, I knew that that's what the situation was, because in this pamphlet, and it came out from Pendle Hill, they talk about, they even talk about Quaker here. The difficult and precedent-breaking task of battlefield nurse. Cornelia Hancock was often the first or only woman to reach a dangerous area at the front. And they go on about this. And it talks about the education of women and the fact that, other things I read, the fact that the women, Quaker women, were very anxious. They were very involved with the abolitionist movement because they felt if the slaves were given equality, they would get equality. Women would. And that went all through, and I thought that's where That's where it started. And this was done in, it's a Pendle Hill pamphlet 196. I don't know the date. 1974 from Pendle Hill. And on the cover is Lucretia Mott.
Was Cornelia involved in a friends meeting here or there, as an adult?
Here she was. Yes, she was birthright. It wasn't until Harvey Hancock married Elizabeth Fogg that the Baptists got into it. and they went more toward the Baptists.
I read it, right here. The Quaker women were accustomed to running their own meetings,
Separate but
meetings,
equal.
recording things, and then when the abolitionist movement arose and temperance and other things, there were all these experienced women ready to take the lead in a lot of these things.
Well, they were raised separate but equal and educated. And in the other religions, you don't have that happening. So that's what, in fact, you were the one that really started me on this, because you asked me what motivated Cornelia to go to Gettysburg. And that's when I started thinking and reading about it. And it was separate but equal and well educated. Because many of the other religions, the women couldn't even read and write. And the man took, whatever she had became his when they married. And that's why Cornelia wasn't going to share anything. But I think because her brother-in-law was a doctor, perhaps that's why this twin thing never came up anywhere. But and the people that she knew, Dr. Breed and Dr. and Mrs. Breed and Harriet Tubman and Louisa May Alcott, a lot of these were in the hospitals and so forth after the war that she met, like Louisa May Alcott. What's his name? The poet from Camden. Walt Whitman, yes. He was down in one of the hospitals also. And so, in fact, he's right across the little pond, buried from my aunt and uncle. So, it's just one of those things that I should add people to this, but Dr. and Mrs. Abraham Lincoln, Andrew Johnson, because she called on him, Secretary of State Seward, she got to know because Mrs. Seward was Ellen's. And this, you can see all my little here in this book, Women's Radical Reconstruction, Freedmen's Aid Movement. There's a lot of information in there if you're interested in something other than just her letters that she did. And when I was at Swarthmore at the Friends Library, I had Emily's Howland's, the 2 books about her, because I had just discovered her. And up there, again, references to Cornelia in these books, I had these in there, and they said, this one, The World of Emily Howland, Odyssey of a Humanitarian, was the one that was based on all the true facts. This one took some liberty with the facts by Mildred Myers, Miss Emily. She said this one took, but you can see all my marks where Cornelia is mentioned in here. And some of them are really, really, Ellen's sister, Cornelia Hancock, needs no introduction. She numbers among the few well-known Civil War nurses. They're talking about Ellen's sister. And it says, Emily Howland spent many hours in the child's home discussing the ethical and moral issues involved in slavery and women's rights. Child, Howland, and Reed also happened to share enthusiasm for botany, and on one occasion they went off to the swamplands of New Jersey to find rare specimens for their prize herbarariums. Probably down here in the swamps.
Well, there's swamps plenty other places.
Yep, the swamp is always open.
I was wondering where the site in Mannington you mentioned was.
The William Nicholson House is that they're talking about at the Historical Society today. Well, that was where Rachel Nicholson's father was born, that house. And it's on a back road. I can't think of the name of the road. And it's along the water, too. I don't know whether it's the Alloways Creek runs behind it, or the Salem. The Salem River's really a lot of tributaries, but one of the creeks runs behind it. But it's off of 45. If you go, what's that road that goes where the Fenwick Monument is, and it goes off to the left? Compromise Road. It's you turn onto another road off Compromise Road. Is that what the?
Well, no, maybe it's not. Maybe it's farther down.
There's a Du Bois Road there too.
No, that's farther.
It's farther down.
That's farther down.
Oh, okay.
Let's name that road.
Well, anyway, that's where, Rachel's father originated. But of course, they came from over here in Elseboro, the Nicholson house, the original Nicholson house, and went on from there. Down, I found every owner of the Hancock house prior to the state buying it was connected to the Hancocks by blood or by marriage or both. Because there was only a small pool of people in the beginning. So we're all kind of interconnected. So you don't say anything bad about anybody because you're connected to them.
Yeah, you learned that early.
I was wondering, were all the different Hancocks, all these different branches of families, were they all connected to a single or a couple of people that came from England to begin with?
Down here, yes. I found an oddball one, and I've never connected it, up in Burlington County. But the ones down here were all. But what I didn't tell you is a man in Cherry Hill was related somehow to Hancocks and so forth. And he traced back to find out the ones who came here were connected to John, who found it here. There was Edward Hancock, who was a brother to William Hancock and Richard, who came over here. Their sister, Jane Hancock, in England, married John Lee. John Lee's son immigrated to Virginia, and Dr. Finley from California said, aha, I don't know what transpired first. I can't remember. It was so long ago. Anyway, he said, oh, that's why for generations there was a Hancock Lee in those Virginia Lees, like Robert E. Lee, his ancestors. Well, here, he's descended also, if you go back to England, to Jane Hancock, married John Lee. So in the Civil War, you have kin versus kin is what I did one display on. And if you I took this down to the kids at Mount Pleasant, if you put the picture of Robert E. Lee in his uniform up, and you put William Nicholson Hancock's picture Cornelia's brother, in his uniform up. They both are posed about the same. You'd swear they were brothers, just looking at them. Pretty big nose and so forth. They look like brothers. So
I'm curious now to look up where I grew up in Monmouth County, and we used to go to the beach at Fort Hancock. And I'm curious now, I'm gonna have to look up where that Hancock came from.
yeah, there was one in Burlington, and also I found Hancock Fruit Company in Florida and so forth. So, you know, there were more than one, but this Hancock line, the ones here, Morris Hancock, two of them were given land from their mother she was a Thompson heiress and had lots of land in Elsinboro. So they were from that family, but they all came from John Hancock. So it's like, as I said, you know, you just don't say anything bad about anybody. And I found that out. I said to my husband, I know what's wrong with you. Your grandmother, Elizabeth Fogg, descended from Edward Hancock, one of the twin Hancocks that John had. And then I found out that my Leaden ancestor, female, was down in Morris River area and married anyway, one of them married a West. A West married a Cheeseman. And here, my mother and my my grandmother and grandfather were not only on the same road in two different counties, but 5 or 6 generations back, they're related the same way Horace's family is. So I couldn't say that anymore. As I said, you can't say anything bad.
Okay, thank you.
So we may find out we're related if your family was here back in the 1700s, because there was not very many people.